It was 2:30 in the morning when I got the call. My name's Mike Dawson, and I've been a police officer in rural Wisconsin for almost 10 years now. The area isn't exactly what you'd call crime-ridden, but there's always something to deal with: drunks, domestic disputes, a few break-ins here and there. But nothing that ever prepared me for what happened that night. I was on night patrol, cruising along the desolate highway, listening to the hum of the radio. It was one of those nights where the cold air made everything feel heavier, like the world was holding its breath. Then, the dispatcher's voice crackled through my radio. "Mike, we got a 10 to 56 call. Possible break-in at 734 Woodlawn Lane. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises. Unit 2 is en route, but they'll be 15 minutes out. You're closer." "Copy that," I replied, my voice steady, but my stomach was already starting to churn. I didn't like the sound of it. It was too quiet. You could feel the hairs on the back of your neck rise when something didn't sit right, and this was one of those times. I knew the address. The house had been abandoned for years. There was no one living there. Not since the old couple, the Wills, passed away. Everyone knew it was creepy, but nobody ever dared to do anything about it. Local legend had it that the Wills had died under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was a botched robbery. Others said something far darker. But nobody really knew for sure. I always thought it was just one of those small-town stories to keep kids out of trouble. I pulled up at the house, the old Victorian-style structure looming in front of me like a shadow. The windows were dark. The porch light flickered on and off as if it were trying to warn me to turn around. I got out of the car, my boots crunching the snow beneath me. I made my way toward the front door, hand on my holster, eyes scanning the surroundings. The air smelled stale, like something had been decaying for a long time. But the odd thing was, it didn't feel abandoned. There was no telltale silence of a place left to rot. As I reached for the doorknob, a strange sound echoed from inside, scraping like metal against wood. My heart rate picked up. I knocked first, just to be cautious. No answer. I called out, "This is Officer Dawson. I'm coming in." The door creaked open with ease, revealing an eerie darkness. I stepped inside, the hairs on my neck standing up as I surveyed the hallway. There was a faint flicker of light coming from the back of the house, but nothing else seemed out of place. Then I heard it again, the sound. A dragging noise. I wasn't alone. I moved down the hallway slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the blackness. The light landed on the kitchen, where the noise seemed to be coming from. There, crouched on the floor, was a figure, a man, his back to me. He was dragging something heavy, a long, wet-sounding scrape following him with each movement. I couldn't make out what it was, but the sickening sound of it made my stomach twist. "Stop right there," I shouted, but the figure didn't move. It just kept dragging whatever it was closer. I reached for my radio, but before I could call for backup, the figure turned to face me. And that's when I saw it. His face was wrong, distorted. His eyes were wide and unblinking, like they'd been stretched too far, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. His skin was pallid, stretched over bones, and something dark smeared across his lips. It wasn't blood, it looked like oil. He didn't speak. He just stared at me, his lips parting, letting out an unsettling wheeze that sent a chill straight to my bones. In that moment, everything in me screamed to run. But I couldn't. Something was wrong, and I knew I had to act. I raised my gun, aiming directly at him. "Get on the ground. Now," I yelled. Instead of complying, he did the opposite. He lunged forward, no warning, no hesitation. The next few seconds were a blur. I fired, but it didn't stop him. His hands were on me, cold and clammy, and he was dragging me backward. I struggled, trying to break free, but his grip was like iron. The scrape of whatever he was dragging was getting louder, closer, until I saw it. It wasn't just a body, not like I thought. It was pieces, chunks of something or someone. Stitched together, the limbs grotesquely fused like a twisted Frankenstein's monster. It was horrifying, and I couldn't look away. I managed to break free, stumbling backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I fired once more, hitting the man in the shoulder, but he didn't even flinch. He only smiled wider, like this was some sick game. I knew I couldn't fight this alone. There was something wrong with this place, with him. I bolted toward the door, not caring if I made a sound anymore. Just run. Just get out. As I sprinted back to my car, I looked over my shoulder. The figure was standing in the doorway, watching me leave as if he knew I wouldn't be back. I couldn't explain what happened that night, what I saw, or who that man was. But when the backup arrived and we went back to search the house, there was no sign of him, no sign of the body, just a bloodied mess on the floor as if it had all been a dream. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. Some things, once you've seen them, you can't unsee. And whatever I faced in that house that night, it's still out there. If you ever find yourself in the woods of Wisconsin, stay away from 734 Woodlawn Lane. Trust me, you don't want to know what happens when the lights go out. It's been a week since that night, and I still haven't slept properly. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure, his twisted face, and the horrific thing he was dragging. I keep telling myself it was some kind of hallucination, but deep down, I know it wasn't. What I saw was real. That man, or whatever he was real. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but it's impossible to ignore the creeping feeling that something's watching me. I've been hearing noises at night, scraping sounds just like before. Sometimes I wake up and swear I see shadows moving in the corners of my room. But when I turn on the lights, nothing's there. I didn't want to tell anyone at the station. They'd think I was losing it, and honestly, I didn't know how to explain what happened without sounding insane. But the pressure of keeping it to myself was suffocating. So, I called Jake Connors, an old friend from another department. He's been a detective for years, and I trusted him. We met at a bar on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. I don't know why, but I felt safer talking to him there. It felt like the world outside didn't matter, like we could be free from whatever had happened. "You've been quiet since the call," Jake said, his eyes narrowing as he took a swig from his beer. "You look like hell, Mike. What's going on?" I didn't beat around the bush. I told him everything. The noises, the figure, the body parts, everything. Jake listened intently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he set his drink down slowly, looking me dead in the eyes. "Mike, I've heard rumors about that house," he said, his voice low. "And not just from the usual sources. There's talk about something wrong with that place. It's not just the Will's deaths. This goes deeper. People have gone missing around there. Cops too. Never found." I froze. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's a history of disappearances in that area, people who got too close, too curious. They didn't make it back. I've been looking into it, but there's nothing concrete, just whispers and rumors. The kind of things that get ignored." Jake stared at his drink, his fingers tapping the edge of his glass. "The thing is, Mike, I don't think it's just a coincidence that you ended up at that house. There's something wrong about it. Something that isn't human." I didn't want to believe him, but the feeling in my gut, the gut-wrenching certainty that what we were dealing with was far from normal, made it hard to ignore. "Jake, what are you saying? That whatever I saw, whatever it was, wasn't just some guy playing a sick joke?" He nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'm saying." I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. My instincts told me to walk away, to forget about it and move on. But I couldn't. There was something that had been gnawing at me ever since that night. The feeling that it wasn't over. That the thing I saw was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "What do we do now?" Jake glanced around, then leaned in closer. "We need to go back to the house. We need to see if we can find any evidence that can explain what's going on. If we don't, I'm afraid it'll keep happening. And next time, it might not just be you it comes for." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. I wanted to tell him to forget it, that I wasn't going anywhere near that place again. But I couldn't. I felt trapped, like there was no escaping it now. That night, Jake and I drove to 734 Woodlawn Lane. The area was as desolate as I remembered. The house loomed in front of us, an unnatural darkness surrounding it, like the world itself was trying to push it out of existence. Jake parked the car, and we both got out, our boots crunching the snow underfoot. The air felt colder than I remembered, biting into my skin like a warning. We approached the house cautiously, my hand on my gun, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake had a flashlight, and we used it to illuminate the path ahead. The door was ajar, just like the last time. I felt my pulse race as we entered the house. The smell hit us first, stale, metallic, almost like blood had soaked into the walls over time. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we made our way through the dark hallway. But something was different this time. It was quiet, too quiet. We reached the kitchen, where I'd encountered the figure before, But this time it was empty. There was no sign of the twisted man or the grotesque thing he had been dragging. Just silence. Then we heard it. A scraping noise from upstairs. We exchanged a glance, and without a word, we began moving up the stairs. As we reached the top, the noise grew louder, dragging. Something heavy was being pulled along the floor. We followed the sound to the last door on the right. It was slightly cracked open. Jake nudged it open with his foot, and we stepped inside. What we saw made me freeze. In the corner of the room, on the floor, lay something that shouldn't have been possible. It was a body, no, multiple bodies, each one twisted and broken in unnatural ways. The parts were stitched together, mismatched, and barely holding on to one another. But the most horrifying thing wasn't just the bodies. It was the eyes. They were watching us, blinking slowly as if they were alive. And standing in front of them was the figure. His smile twisted even wider as he turned toward us. And that's when I realized it wasn't just a hallucination. He had been waiting for us. We were next. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the figure. His smile stretched impossibly wide, and his eyes gleamed with a madness I could never fully comprehend. The room seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick with an oppressive, suffocating pressure. Jake's voice broke through the paralysis. "Mike, we need to move. Now." He didn't have to tell me twice. Without thinking, I reached for my gun, but my hands were shaking. I aimed it at the figure who, despite the terror that should have frozen me in place, was now slowly stepping toward us, dragging the broken bodies behind him like a grotesque parade. I fired. Once. Twice. But the shots didn't seem to faze him. He didn't flinch, didn't even slow down. I backed away, tugging Jake toward the door, but he wasn't moving. His eyes were locked on the figure, his face pale as a ghost. "Jake, let's go," I urged, my voice frantic. He barely heard me. He was too focused on the thing that was inching closer, its dragging steps growing louder with each passing moment. Then, in one sudden motion, the figure stopped. He stood perfectly still, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whispering sound coming from the corner of the room. I turned toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The bodies on the floor were moving. Asterisk twitching. Asterisk, I didn't know if I was hallucinating from fear or if it was real, but one of the bodies, the one in the farthest corner, began to slowly rise, its arms jerking unnaturally, the stitches holding it together pulling and stretching. Its head turned toward us, and its eyes opened, and they were filled with a hollow emptiness. Jake finally broke free from his trance, his voice shaking. "Mike, we need to leave. Now. This isn't just a man. It's something else. Something evil." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed Jake's arm and dragged him toward the door, but just as we reached the threshold, the figure let out a deep, guttural laugh that shook the entire house. The door slammed shut behind us, trapping us inside. I swung around to face it, my heart racing. The house groaned as if it were alive, the floorboards creaking and the walls shuddering. The air grew colder, and I felt something wet brush against my neck. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Only shadows. The figure was gone. I didn't care where it went. I was done. I needed to get out, get far away from here. I reached for the door again, but this time it wouldn't budge. I pushed, I pulled, nothing. Then I heard it, a soft thudding from behind me, like something dragging along the floor. I turned around, my breath hitching in my throat. It was him. The figure stood at the top of the stairs, his twisted face staring down at us. And behind him, asterisk behind him, asterisk, the bodies were rising. All of them. They were moving, their limbs contorting and snapping into place as if they were puppets on invisible strings. We were trapped. There was no escape. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that nightmare. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, but it wasn't until I heard a voice, low, gravelly, that I realized I wasn't alone. "You're not leaving," the figure whispered. His voice was like nails on a chalkboard, scraping across my soul. The words sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake, like something dark and ancient had just claimed me. Jake tried to run, he bolted for the window. But as soon as he reached it, something yanked him back with a force so violent it left me gasping in disbelief. The window shattered into a million pieces as he was pulled into the air and tossed across the room like a rag doll. I didn't even have time to react. The figure was standing right in front of me now. The stench of decay hit me first, damp, sour, like something had been rotting for years. His face was inches from mine, the madness in his eyes now replaced by something far more terrifying, hunger. I raised my gun again, but before I could pull the trigger, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was icy cold, sending a shock of freezing pain through my arm. His fingers dug into my skin, and I felt something slither into my mind. For a moment, I saw flashes, visions of things I couldn't explain. The bodies. The missing people. The house, its walls, its floors, even its very foundation were built on something ancient. Something evil. This wasn't a man. It wasn't a monster. It was something far worse. Something that had existed long before any of us, something that thrived on fear, on death. The thing in front of me wasn't just trying to kill us. It was feeding on us, on our terror, on the very essence of our souls. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The figure leaned in closer, his mouth opening wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, like a predator that had waited too long for its meal. But then, just as I thought it was all over, I heard a voice. A real one. Mike. It was Jake. I snapped my head toward the sound, and that's when I saw him. He wasn't in the corner anymore. He wasn't on the floor. He was standing, alive asterisk but not human star. His eyes were wide, too wide, like they had been stretched beyond reason. His skin was pale, almost translucent. But what terrified me more was the smile. It was the same twisted grin I'd seen on the figure, stretched impossibly wide, as if Jake was becoming one of them. The figure released me, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, heart pounding in my chest. Then it spoke again. You're just the beginning. And that's when I realized the truth. The house, the thing that lived inside it, it wasn't just a monster. It was an infection. And now it had claimed us. The room seemed to close in on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. My mind was racing, but everything felt distant. Like I was watching it all unfold from a nightmare that I couldn't escape. Jake. Asterisk that thing asterisk that used to be Jake. Took a slow, deliberate step toward me, his movements jerky, like they weren't entirely his own. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and that smile, it wasn't his. I scrambled backward, trying to get to my feet, but the floor seemed to shift beneath me. The bodies that had been scattered around the room were no longer just lying there, they were standing, too. The stitched-together monstrosities had risen, and now they were all staring at me with those same dead, empty eyes. I was surrounded, and I realized too late that I had walked into a trap that had been set long before my arrival. Jake, asterisk no, not Jake asterisk, was closer now, his smile growing wider with every step he took toward me. The man that I had known as my partner was gone. The thing that stood before me had no trace of humanity left. It was something else, something dark, something that couldn't be killed by a bullet, something that had been waiting for years, maybe decades, for a victim like me. I could hear the whispers again, those soft, guttural voices coming from the bodies around me. They weren't speaking to each other. They were speaking to me. You're not getting out. We're all here. We've always been here. There's nowhere to run. I could feel it then, the walls, the very foundation of the house, breathing around me. It was like the house itself was alive, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and I ran. There was no thinking, no planning, just the primal instinct to survive. I didn't care where I went, I just had to get out. I sprinted toward the back door, but just as my hand touched the doorknob, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I screamed and yanked my leg, but whatever it was, some kind of vine or tendril I couldn't tell, pulled me back with an inhuman strength. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, but the room was spinning. I tried to grab my gun, but it was too late. The figure asterisk at asterisk was on top of me now, its cold breath heavy against my face. I could see the malice in its eyes, the hunger. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a house, it was a prison. And we were its inmates. The figure didn't speak this time. It didn't have to. I could feel its presence in my mind, its consciousness invading my thoughts like a poison. It wanted me to understand. It wanted me to know that there was no escape, no help coming, that it had claimed this place long before I had arrived. And then, with a sickening twist, I saw the truth. The bodies that had been stitched together weren't just victims. They were part of it. They had become extensions of the thing that had been waiting. They weren't dead. Not entirely. They were part of its world, part of its reality. Jake, or whatever it was that had once been Jake, knelt beside me, his face inches from mine. His eyes were black, pits of emptiness. The smile stretched wider, pulling at his skin, as he whispered, "You'll join us. You'll be one of us. I felt my stomach churn, my body convulsing in fear, and I fought against the grip that held me. But no matter how hard I struggled, I couldn't move. The house was alive, it wouldn't let me go. I could hear the soft, wet sound of footsteps behind me, and I twisted my head in desperation. One of the bodies, its skin sagging, its stitches barely holding it together, was moving toward me. It wasn't human anymore. It was just a thing, but it still had the eyes of a person. I could see the faint flicker of recognition in its gaze. And that's when I understood. This was the fate of anyone who came close to the house. This was what happened when you lingered too long, when you dared to investigate the darkness. You didn't just die. You didn't just get consumed. You were transformed, turned into a part of the house, a part of the thing that lived within it. And there was no escape. The figure leaned closer to me, its cold, rotting hand reaching for my face. I felt its fingers brush against my skin, and I knew in that moment that if it touched me, if I let it, it would be the end. But then something shifted. A sound, something loud and distant, rang out in the house, breaking the spell. It was a crash, then another, then the unmistakable sound of a voice shouting from outside. "Mike! Mike, are you in there?" I didn't know who it was, but for the first time since entering the house, I felt a spark of hope. The figure turned toward the noise, its expression twisted in rage. No one gets out. But it wasn't paying attention to me anymore. It was distracted. The tendrils holding me loosened just enough for me to pull my arm free. With every ounce of strength I had left, I scrambled to my feet, my vision swimming. I didn't think, didn't question what was happening. I just ran. I burst through the back door, my breath ragged, my legs burning. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't stop. I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, dragging. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been minutes, hours, or maybe it was only seconds. But when I finally reached the edge of the property, I saw the headlights of a car. A figure stepped out, and I nearly collapsed with relief. It was Officer Carter, one of the guys from the station. "Mike, you okay? We heard you screaming on the radio. What the hell happened in there?" I couldn't speak. I just pointed behind me, toward the house. But when Carter turned, there was nothing there. The house was gone. There were no walls, no windows, no twisted figures standing in the doorway. It was just an empty patch of land. But I knew it wasn't over. The thing that had lived there, it was still out there. It had never left. And now it knew my name. I thought I'd made it out. I thought that once I crossed the threshold of that property, once I was outside the boundary of the house, I would be safe. But nothing about that night, nothing about it was ever going to let me go. As Officer Carter helped me to his car, I was in a daze, my mind barely able to process what had just happened. He kept asking me questions, what had happened inside, what I saw, why I was covered in dirt and bruises, but I couldn't form the words to explain. How do you explain a nightmare that's real, that's beyond anything logical? How do you tell someone you were chased by something that isn't even human? When we got to the station, I tried to pull myself together to convince myself it was over. I filed a report, but I didn't mention the bodies or the figure or the house disappearing. I couldn't even begin to make sense of it. I just told them about the call, the break-in, and the fact that I didn't find anyone inside, just a mess, some signs of vandalism, and a weird feeling that something was off. The report was short, vague, and as normal as I could make it. But nothing about that night felt normal anymore. I went home, exhausted, but the moment I walked through the door, I felt it was still with me star. The oppressive weight, the air that felt too thick, the way the shadows in the corners of my apartment seemed to move when I wasn't looking. It was like the thing from that house had followed me, seeped into my skin, into my very bones. It was everywhere. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made my heart race. The creak of the floorboards, the gust of wind against my window, the flickering of my light, every little noise sent me into a panic. I had to keep the lights on. I had to keep moving. I even checked every room twice, just to make sure there were no shadows watching me. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like being in a room full of eyes, waiting, watching. The next morning, I drove back to the station to check in. Carter wasn't there, and no one had heard from him. It wasn't unusual for officers to take a day off, but I had this gnawing feeling that something was wrong. I brushed it off. It was probably just the stress of the night before. But when I went into the break room to grab a cup of coffee, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a map asterisk, the map asterisk of the area. And there on the map was a circle drawn in thick red ink around 734 Woodlawn Lane. But this time, the circle extended far beyond the house. It covered the entire region, the outskirts of town, a wide stretch of land I knew well. I stared at it for a long moment. My heart started racing again, a deep unease creeping up my spine. "Mike?" A voice called from behind me. I spun around, startled. It was Detective Jameson. He was an older guy, been with the department longer than I had, and something about his face told me he was dealing with something more than just a standard case. "You all right?" he asked, stepping toward me. I nodded quickly, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. He looked at the map, then back at me, his expression serious. "You seen Carter today?" he asked, lowering his voice. I felt a knot form in my stomach. "No, I haven't." "Why?" Jameson looked around to make sure no one was listening. "There's been some strange stuff going on. You're not the only one who's been having trouble with that house." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then pulled out a file from under his arm. It was thick, filled with documents and photos. He flipped it open and showed me a picture. It was of Officer Carter. But it wasn't the Carter I knew. The man in the picture had eyes wide open, unblinking, but they were hollow black. His mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, exactly like the figure I had seen. His skin was pale and stretched, his features contorted as if something was wearing his face. I took a step back. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. Jameson's face was grim. "We've been getting reports for years, Mike. Officers, civilians, people who get too close to 734 Woodlawn Lane. Asterisk they change star. It's like something possesses them. Something from that place. And it's spreading." I shook my head, trying to grasp what he was saying. "You're telling me Carter, he's not himself anymore?" Jameson nodded slowly, his voice almost a whisper. "No one who gets close to that house ever comes back the same. We tried to investigate years ago, but anyone who looked too deeply, they disappeared. And the ones who didn't, the ones who survived, they were never the same. They become like that." He pointed to the photo again. I felt the weight of his words sink in. "So what do we do?" He grimaced, looking down at the file in his hands. "We're doing the same thing we've always done. Pretend it's not there. Ignore the rumors. But we both know it's not going away. And soon, it'll be too late to stop it." I didn't say anything. My mind was racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, just as I was about to ask him what we could do next, I felt it. A cold, tingling sensation down my spine. The room seemed to shift, and I turned, half expecting to see something behind me. But there was nothing, except the photo of Carter. And I realized I wasn't alone anymore. It was there, lurking, waiting in the shadows of my mind, in the corners of my vision. Whatever I had escaped from, whatever was still in that house, was coming for me. And this time there would be no running. The days that followed were nothing but a blur of fear and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was watching me from the darkness. I tried to go about my daily routine, tried to convince myself it was just the aftereffects of the terror I'd experienced. But deep down, I knew I was fooling myself. The house had marked me. Whatever was inside that place, whatever it was that had claimed Carter, was now following me, too. I kept hearing it, the whispers, soft, distant murmurs that no one else seemed to hear. They would come when I was alone, when the world around me was quiet enough to listen. They weren't in my head, though. They were real. I could hear them in the walls, in the floors, sometimes in the wind outside my window. Sometimes, it sounded like someone was calling my name. But when I would look, there was never anyone there. The worst part was the dreams. I couldn't escape them. Every time I closed my eyes, I would be back there, at 734 Woodlawn Lane. I'd be running through the hallways, but no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't escape the sound of something dragging behind me, something getting closer. And every time I would reach the door, the figure would be standing in my way, blocking my exit. It would smile that grotesque smile, and the whisper would echo in my ears, "You can't leave." And I knew deep down that it was true. I couldn't leave. Not now. Not ever. By the end of the week, I was losing my grip. The paranoia was starting to take over, and the exhaustion from sleepless nights was making it hard to think straight. I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming anymore. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I couldn't even step outside without feeling like the thing from the house was right behind me. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back to the house. I had to face whatever it was once and for all. I couldn't keep running. The house had gotten into my head. It had gotten into me. I had to destroy it or it would destroy me. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. I knew they would try to stop me, or worse, they would lock me up for what I was about to do. But I had no choice. I had to end this. I drove back to Woodlawn Lane in the dead of night, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The town was completely still, and the road was deserted. The moment I turned onto the dirt road leading to the house, I felt it, the pressure, the weight in the air. The house was waiting. It knew I was coming. As I pulled up, the car's headlights illuminated the outline of the house, standing like a shadow in the night. The porch light flickered on and off, just like it had the night I first stepped inside. But this time, there was no hesitation. I got out of the car and walked toward the house, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the door, it creaked open by itself, just as it had before. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside, the air thick with decay, the smell of something dead lingering in the walls. The house seemed to breathe with me, the floorboards groaning under my weight, the darkness pressing in from every side. I knew I was walking into the belly of the beast. I could feel it, the thing that lived here, that had infected everyone who had ever come near. Asterisk at asterisk was waiting. I walked through the hallway, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls seemed to close in around me, the oppressive feeling growing heavier with every step. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to keep it together, but the fear was eating at me. The whispers were louder now, like they were right in my ear. I reached the kitchen, the place where it had all begun. But when I turned the corner, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The figure. It was standing there, in the middle of the room, waiting for me. Its face was a distorted mockery of a human being. Its mouth stretched too wide, its eyes black and empty, like pits to hell. And behind it, the bodies were moving. They weren't just standing anymore. They were walking, crawling. They were coming toward me. "You came back," the figure whispered, its voice a rasp, like it had been dragged through years of rot. "You shouldn't have. You're ours now." I backed away, my heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. This was it. The end. But then something inside me snapped. The fear, the terror, the exhaustion, it all boiled over. I raised my gun, aiming it at the figure, my hands steady despite the terror clawing at me. I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the figure square in the chest, but it didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. It just smiled wider, impossibly wide. But I kept firing, round after round, until the gun was empty. The figure's smile never wavered. And then something happened. The house shuddered as if reacting to my defiance. The walls creaked, the floor groaned, and the air grew colder. The figure's smile began to fade, replaced by something darker, something angrier. The whispers grew louder, like a cacophony in my mind, drowning out everything else. And that's when I saw it. The house asterisk, the thing inside the house asterisk, was alive. It wasn't just the figure. It was the entire place. The walls. The floors. The very foundation was a living, breathing entity. The bodies were just vessels, parts of it. The figure wasn't a man. It was the embodiment of the house itself. And it had been waiting for someone to challenge it, to defy it. It needed that. I realized too late that there was no destroying it. There was no escaping it. The house had claimed me just like it had claimed everyone before me. It had always been here, feeding on fear, feeding on the souls of the living. It didn't need to be destroyed. It didn't need to kill. It just needed to consume. I felt the floor beneath me tremble, then crack open, the darkness swallowing me whole. And then, nothing. The last thing I remember was the figure's smile, as wide as ever as the house closed in. I don't know how long it's been since that night. Time doesn't work the same here. But I know one thing for sure, I'm not alone. And I'll never be free. Because the house is alive. And now so am I. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you,